Good evening, and welcome to the Jay's 72nd Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. My name is Brenda Brook, and I'm co-chair of the Book Fair Steering Committee. And Book Fair is proudly sponsored by the Jay, where you can find your Jewish center. Book Fair would like to thank, for their continued support, our Platinum Day sponsors, Alyssa Mertz and Susan Sovell, and our sponsor, the Berman Center for the Performing Arts. And thanks to all of our generous patrons and sponsors, we're able to bring you most of our programs free of charge. So I invite you to become a patron or a sponsor also. I'd like to thank Schuler Books, our community bookseller partner for 2023, and I also want to extend my deepest gratitude to the entire Book Fair Steering Committee. Their dedication and their hard work have made all of this possible. We have a dynamic lineup of fantastic authors and programs that you won't want to miss. So if you don't have a brochure, you can pick one up at the table in front. And please visit our bookstore at the end of tonight's program. Your purchases there help us bring the book fair to you and allow us to bring in all of these wonderful authors to our community. And I know a lot of you go online to buy books. Right before we came in tonight, I went online to check the price of this book. If you buy it online, you're going to save 35 cents. But that doesn't help us. And you can't get it signed by our wonderful author. So please, shop our bookstore. If you like to buy online, we also have a bookstore online, bookshop.org. And if you put in JCC Detroit, it will pop up, and we get a percentage of that also. And they have many more books than what we have here. So it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's special guests. Natasha Lance Rogoff is an award-winning filmmaker, journalist, television producer, and author of Muppets in Moscow, The Unexpected Crazy True Story of Making Sesame Street in Russia. She wrote extensively about Russian underground culture and led the production of Sesame Street in Russia and Mexico. She's an associate in the Art, Film, and Visual Studies Department at Harvard University. And Muppets in Moscow was nominated for the prestigious Pushkin Book Prize in 2023, and it won first prize for Best First Book and Best Audio Book from the Independent Publishers Association and the Independent Book Awards. Natasha's conversation partner tonight is Sarah Allen, the Chief Operating Officer of the Jay and a lifelong member of the Detroit Jewish community. She grew up in Huntington Woods and lived for her summers at Tamarack camps, as did I. Before coming to the Jay, Sarah was the Executive Director of Repair the World Detroit from 2017 to 2021. And she's passionate about building a vibrant and inclusive Jewish community in the city. She lives in Southwest Detroit with her husband Connor and their son Judah. And following the program, Natasha will be signing copies of Muppets in Moscow just outside the gallery. So please take a moment, silence your cell phones, anything that lights up, beeps, makes noise, vibrates, and please join me in warmly welcoming Natasha Lance Rogoff and Sarah Allen.
Hello, Natasha. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having
me.
me.
Really looking forward to chatting. And thank you all so much for being here. Before we get started, I would just be curious to know, has anybody read the book yet? Oh, that's great. Well, if you haven't, you're going to want to, I promise. I loved this book. I really loved it. I started reading it the night before the invasion in Israel, and then it took me about a week to read the whole book. And as this violence was unfolding in Israel and our hearts were breaking, and we were all glued to our phones and the news, and it was so upsetting. But I ended my day with your book, and I have to say that in one of the darkest weeks I can remember, your book gave me so much hope and so much joy, because it is truly about building something beautiful across lines of difference. And I can't tell you how meaningful it was to have that be the last thing on my mind before going to bed that week. So thank you.
Well, it's very, very sweet of you to say. Really appreciate it. And, this whole period, both following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and then on top of that, what's happened in Israel, has been, just an incredible moment looking at ways in which the world has shifted to having differences between countries, as well as the divisions within our own country, become forefront in creating destabilization throughout the world. So this period of time that we're going to take you to tonight, which is the 1990s in Russia, just after the Soviet Union collapsed, is a really fascinating time. And what I have found this last year, I've been crisscrossing the US as well as in Europe 3 times, where the war is ever, much more present for people there. There are so many Ukrainians in London, in Paris, and Russians, more than 1.5 million, have now left their own country because they don't support the war and don't want to fight. So, I've been asked myself too, why has this book been resonating? When I'm a first-time writer, I'm really a filmmaker. So I thought, what is this about? I thought when I write this, my husband will read it, maybe my grandkids. So this has been fascinating to see. But it's the journey of making Sesame Street in Russia really shows us a lot about the values underlining Russian culture and what the people are thinking, and how different the culture is from our own as well. And yet, as Sarah said, there is, through this absolutely insane story of bringing the Muppets to Moscow, we managed to bridge this and make a show that was very successful. So I'm super excited to share this with you tonight.
So we have you have a short video that's going to sort of set the stage for us. But before you show that to us, Natasha, I would love to hear a little bit more about you, and specifically what sparked your interest in and eventual love of Russia.
Well, my grandfather left Belarusia in 1912, and I heard him telling stories about the old country. He spoke Yiddish, and he didn't really speak Russian around me. It was the language of the oppressors. And then in high school, I started reading Russian literature and just became fascinated. I mean, not only was the writing so incredible, but the stories were absurd and beautiful and cruel. And I started thinking I really wanted to visit this country. So I started studying Russian at Berkeley in California, and then went to Leningrad, St. Petersburg, when I was 22. This is 1982, and it's still the Soviet Union. Once I got there, started meeting a lot of artists, and this was part of a U.S. Russian exchange program. So we had 30 students in Moscow and 30 in what is now St. Petersburg. That was our cultural exchange. The people I met, what's fascinating about being there at that time is our roommates were actually KGB agents in training. So we had 3 to a room, and I started also writing about the underground rock musician scene and the LGBTQ community at that time. so wrote a piece for the San Francisco Chronicle, which was an expose in 1983. It was absolutely fascinating to be there, and by the time the program ended, I thought, I don't want to leave. This place is so full of contradictions, and I want to understand it better. It was also, in addition to the literature, also became fascinated by dictatorships and communism. So I ended up spending time in communist China as well. And that's how this all started. Very far from the Muppets.
Yeah. Far from the Muppets. And when you started making films, did you know that you wanted to tell Russian stories and stories of Russian culture?
Yeah, I did. I mean, many of my friends, and I'm sure many of people, they went to Paris or somewhere else, but there was something that really drew me to Russia, and it wasn't just my background. And I met people like Hedrick Smith, who wrote the book called The Russians in the 1970s. He was a New York Times correspondent, and he hired me to work on his films initially. He is not Jewish, and he also was sucked into this culture. So it's a certain type of person who becomes, fascinated by Russia. But, it never fails to captivate you in terms of how much it changes. And this is so important for us to remember today, as we're dealing with a really difficult and horrific time, that this too, this war will end and this will change again.
So speaking of change, this story takes place during a time of significant change for Russia and Russians. And I think it illuminates some aspects of their life and their experience that I personally had never considered or learned about or thought of. How many of us learned about the Cold War and the USSR, but this is a particular moment in time, and so I think it's a good time to show this short clip before we get into the story of the Muppets.
Is to create a program that has never existed here before, which introduces children into the world of learning in a very joyful way and makes them understand that they can achieve anything that they want to in the future.
To share something. Let them share not Terminator, not Rambo, which is now the case, but Sesame Street.
So that's a little sobering. You all came here for the Muppets and you didn't realize what you were going to see.
So help us understand how you ended up taking this project on. What are the origins of this project, and who was involved in ramping up to this amazing saga?
So the U.S. Congress was involved in supporting the idea of a Russian version of Sesame Street. And Sesame Street at this time had a couple of international co-productions, mostly in Europe and in Mexico. And the idea was that this was then Senator Biden, who spearheaded congressional approval for the financing of a Russian version of Sesame Street. And I say that because these international co-productions are not dubbed shows. They're original productions with original Muppets that are going to reflect the culture and the values of that society wherever you're creating the production. And so you're going to have new Muppets, you're going to have a new set, and you're going to work with hundreds and hundreds of artists to create what is going to be a new show for New Russia. So that was the premise. And I had just finished a documentary for PBS called Russia for Sale, The Rough Road to Capitalism, where I had embedded for 2 years with communist fascists who would do anything to prevent the implosion of the Soviet Union. And whenever I was filming, I never mentioned that I was Jewish anywhere because it was pretty dangerous among this group. So I was always Italian and terrified that someday somebody would ask me to say something in Italian, which I didn't speak. But it was at a screening of this particular film in New York City where 2 executives from Sesame Street approached me after watching the film, and they said, "We've been trying to bring Sesame Street to Russia now for 2 years, and we keep getting thwarted. We just can't figure out how to do it. And we'd like you to help us. Would you help us?" And I'm just looking at them and I'm like, did you just watch my film? Because it is as far from the Muppets as you could possibly imagine. And they said, look, just come down to the studio and just talk to us. And I, went down there thinking, I don't know anything about children's television production. I don't have children. I'm single. I'm not even sure I like children, and I walked into this studio and all the walls were, giant painted Big Bird and Elmo, like his hat back there, no. And so then they're explaining to me, what the goal of the show is, for the Muppets to be America's best ambassador and bring, model idealistic values of tolerance, freedom of expression for tens of millions of children across the former Soviet Union. And the idea is that the show would be broadcast on Russia's largest TV station and would be transmitted across 11 time zones. So not just Russia, but Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia. And of course, I thought this is incredibly ambitious. And think about the potential that this could have in this country. And I got very excited about the prospect of this, although also terrified, because I had no experience managing any type of production like this, of this size. But I said yes. And when I got there in 1993, I very quickly realized that I had completely underestimated the challenges to creating a puppet show for kids.
You were in charge, responsible for it felt like every aspect of this production, which doing that here sounds incredibly daunting. If your background isn't in children's television, but to do this in Russia at that time, it almost seemed impossible, the way you set it up in the book. And especially when it came to the business dealings in Russia and then between the US and Russia. There were a dozen times in this book when it felt like this is it. They're going to pull the plug. It's over. And a lot of that had to do with the incredible violence that you and your team faced in getting this production together. Can you talk a little bit about your experience there with the business side, and especially in that climate?
Yeah, the last thing you expect when you're making a children's puppet show is, that people are going to be assassinated. And I was, initially it was very difficult because the Congress wouldn't release the appropriated funds unless we matched the funding with Russian funding. And there were a group of legislators who said, Russia needs to have skin in the game. Otherwise, we're not going to just pay for them to have a children's show. And I agreed with that. And so the first, we were trying to get, we were meeting all these different business people. In the first part of the book, I write about this, meeting with different, new businessmen, because capitalism had only just become legal. One guy, we have a meeting and he's got like a shark in his office circling as we're talking to him about funding a children's TV show. And
when you're brought into some dark building and sat down in front of 6 different men,
12 bankers,
12 Russian bankers.
Yeah, there are some really amazing stories in there. But we finally got this meeting with an oligarch that many of you will recognize today as Boris Berezovsky. But at the time, he was basically a car salesman, and a very rich car salesman, and he also had his hand in Russian television. So we met with him, and he had 2 bodyguards with him. And we met him at a restaurant. I was with my colleague, Leonid Zygalsky, who is a Russian journalist who I worked with. So there's a lot about him in the book, too. He wrote the first article about political prisoners being held in psychiatric hospitals in the 1980s in Russia. And I meet with this oligarch, and we're telling him about how, part of this program is to train the Russians in how to make television and how to use media, because most of their media had been used for propaganda purposes. And now we were going to make an entertainment show. So it was different. And the state of Russian television at that time was quite unsophisticated. For instance, they had not yet started filming with 3 cameras. They were not using sync sound, for shooting. All of this had to be technology that was transferred. So the oligarch, Boris, was very excited about that part. And then he said, "So is Big Bird going to be in the show?" And I loved hearing him say Big Bird. And then we were like, no, because you're going to have your own new puppets, new Muppets that we're going to create based on your own culture. So he wasn't, happy about that. But eventually he said, "Okay, I'm in." So we brought that news I went back to the States and told my bosses. And we were all very excited that soon we're going to be able to release the U.S. funds as well. And then 3 weeks later, I got a call from Leonid, my partner in business there, and he told me that there was a car bombing, and Boris's car had been blown up, and he was severely burned. So he disappeared. Like he actually went to London to get treatment, but he had bigger problems to deal with after that, and we lost our funding. About a year later, we found another broadcast partner, and this was a great man who was trying to reform Russia and bring a free press, Vlad Listyev. And he left the studio one day where we were all working, and he was shot in front of his house and killed. The person who replaced him was assassinated 9 months later. So this was the beginning of making Sesame Street in Russia, just to summarize.
That was before the cameras rolled.
Yeah.
And then there was also, I can't remember in the timeline when this took place, but there was a raid on the office building where your team was set up and working. And I believe you were in New York at the time, but...
Yes, the this happened. So after we had been moving further along and we had scripts and a set design and we had bought a whole bunch of computer equipment, we were up and running, and our offices were inside the TV station in ORT in Moscow. And soldiers came in with AK-47s, took over the office, put a lock and a seal on the door, and we lost everything. And that was, another day, another Tuesday in Moscow is all I can say.
I love the little anecdote that one of the producers or the writers, I can't remember, had the foresight to take a fax machine home to his apartment.
Yes.
And that plus what they could grab on their way out.
Oh, we had one of the
production.
Yeah, and one of the soldiers saw we had a life-size Elmo in the office as like our mascot, and he took the Elmo, plush doll, from there and shoved it. He put his AK-47 over to the side and shoved the Muppet underneath his arm and walked out. And we were like, "What?"
Gift for his kid.
Later, I asked the executive producer, why do you think he took that? And he goes, yeah, he probably has a kid, So
it's a miracle that Sesame Street didn't pull the plug on this.
It is a miracle. I mean,
how?
Well, Sesame Street, it's a nonprofit organization, and there was certainly, which I write about in the book as well, an internal battle of people who were looking at this production and thinking, this is going to bring down, the most popular children's television program in America. We've got to get out of here. And there were other people who, Gary Nell, who later became the president of NPR and Nat Geo, who were real champions. And he wrote the foreword to the book. He was later the CEO of Sesame Workshop. And, many other people who really saw how this program could change the country. And I think, we were working with, when all of this is going on, I was constantly arguing with the people that opposed supporting this show at the company for what we were doing, was transformative for the country, for Russia, and would have a huge difference.
Yeah, it's an amazing, and I think you were amazing in sort of navigating all of those challenges and in such a diplomatic way, giving the information just up to a point and knowing when to pull back. This happened because of you, obviously. And,
it's
clear in the book.
We had an incredible team, and the people that we worked with, like the Russians, at this time, it was a period of incredible violence, but also poverty, lawlessness, no rule of law, no Western banks in Moscow at the time. And so for ordinary Russians, this was a really tough time. And it was also a period of incredible humiliation, seeing their superpower collapse in front of the whole world. So, trying to make this show within this landscape was really humbling in terms of trying to understand what they were going through. I could go home anytime I wanted. And I lived in a relatively peaceful country that wasn't in the midst of a revolution.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about that cultural shift and the coming together of this deeply American institution of Sesame Street and the shifting revolutionary moment in Russia. It's so cliche, but they say never meet your heroes. And I think it's because when you peek behind the curtain, sometimes you don't like what you see. But I have to say, I was so happy to see that Sesame Street and the workshop, it feels like, or at this time, it felt like an organization that truly walked the walk when it came to the values. And there were times reading the book when I thought, oh my goodness, is this American company going to come in and impose, our American values, and how are they going to mesh with Russians, and how is this going to resonate? And those ended up being my favorite parts of the book, watching these two cultures come together, because it was deeply personal. It was about relationship building to create something great. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about those cultural clashes, those cultural experiences that I think when you read the book, they amount to this unbelievable thing that you guys created together.
Well, thank you for saying that. The most moving aspect, and for me, the part that I love the most about the book is describing the cultural clashes that happened at that time. For instance, when we first showed the team, the creative team, the American Muppets. So we, let's see if that'll work. Oh, it's not working now. Well, we showed the.
Can we get the?
We showed them the American Muppets, and they looked at it and they said, we don't want those Muppets. They look funny. Oops. Yeah, it's not going.
Where do we point the clicker?
No, we don't want that. Okay.
You want me to try it? Let me see. There we go.
Okay, we're now at Muppets.
Muppets.
Thank God, no more deaths. And so we showed them the Muppets, and the chief writer said to me, Natasha, we have a long revered puppetry tradition, and it dating back to the 16th century, and we don't really need your Muppets, your American Muppets. And then someone else who was the director of live action film, Sergei, he looked very upset, and he said, our puppets are not naked like your puppets. Now, it's true that the Russians have an incredibly rich, very deep puppetry tradition with Obraztsov, and we understood that. It's world-renowned. But the Muppets, created by Jim Henson, they are very different. They're soft. They're not marionettes. They have these giant googly eyes, and they're just very different. So initially, when we talked with the team, it really almost caused an international incident, and they brought in their chief puppet builder, who was a quite well-known man named Kolikomov, to convince me why they had to use their puppets, not Muppets, in their version of Sesame Street. So he came in and he brought his two puppets, and he pulls them out of the sack and starts holding them up and performing with them. Then he picks up a stick, and one puppet starts beating the other puppet. And, my whole team is there laughing, and I'm just sitting here going, oh my God, this is like puppet on puppet violence. Like, this is never gonna fly for Sesame Street. And this is kind of what their puppets look like. So eventually, they, after a lot of discussion, I tried to explain to them, look, we have no choice. They have to be Muppets. This is Sesame Street. Sesame Street's co-productions have Muppets, and there's a lot more that goes into this discussion. But I say, let's just try to come up with some drawings, and it will be based on your own folklore, your own aesthetic. So they come up with, they suddenly get a little excited, and they say, okay, well, we'd like to base it on Domovoy. I'm like, what's Domovoy? They say, that's a spirit. It's from Russian folklore, spirit of the hearth and the home. And this is what he looks like. So they draw pictures, and it's like a Muppet that's sort of a gnarly old man wearing what I think of as a religious cap that looks kind of like a yarmulke. And I bring it back to the Henson team that's going to build these puppets. This is Ed Christie, who's built, and has created, many, many puppets of Jim's. And I was so sad giving him this drawing. And he's like, this is terrible. He said, you've got to go back to them, and the Muppet really has to be childlike and playful so kids can relate to the character. So I go back, and eventually, the interim between this is the Russian team of producers, directors, animators, writers. The key people come to the States, and they meet the puppeteers and visit the set of Sesame Street, which for them is transformative. And there's one story in there where I bring them downtown on the subway in New York City. This is in Queens. They're visiting Queens, and we then are in Manhattan, and I bring them to McSorley's bar so they can try their first, Guinness. And as we're getting out of the subway, a group of black teenagers starts circling us and screaming at the group, "Bert and Ernie, my main man," and all this other stuff. And I'm just like, I completely forgot that I had a orange and yellow Bert and Ernie embossed on my back of my bomber jacket. So this group comes up, and they start talking about their favorite Bert and Ernie segments. And the Russians, none of them speak English, so I'm translating. And they are just stunned. And it's the first time they realize many average Americans know about this children's TV show. And they understood the impact that a show like this might have in their own country. So when they go back to Moscow, they design something else. And what they came up with is what many of the Henson puppet creators today think is the best puppet, the best Muppet that was ever constructed. And that's Zeliboba. Now, as you can see, he's larger than Big Bird, and his fur, in order to be at one with nature, they've sewn pieces of leaves and moss and bark into his coat. And on the set, he lives in a 40-foot tree. The other two characters are Kubik and Businka. And they also have their own creation story, their origin story that deals with, in the case of the female Muppet, many battles over gender. As we see, do you ever see women in the lineup with Putin? Ever. So we were dealing with a very patriarchal society, and initially they wanted the female Muppet to be as she is, as women are in, not women, but girls are in children's Russian fairy tales, which is docile and obedient. So the younger women scriptwriters were like, we've just had a revolution, like 3 years ago. And we would like her to be, bouncy, mischievous, very fiery. And that's who this character is.
There are so many examples like that in the book where it probably wasn't the fastest or most efficient way to produce a television show, but the cultural sensitivity and the respect that was earned in both directions is so evident. And I think that that is such a credit to you and the work that you did, also to Sesame Street. Two of my favorite segments of this book, one where the Russian team came to New York, and then later on in the story, some of the New York team comes to Moscow to do a curriculum workshop because Sesame Street is very, very research-based, and they develop a curriculum with educational goals and rooted in values. And so that had to be a part of the Russian production, just like it has to be a part of any of the international productions. I imagine there was a ton of research done in Russia with focus groups. I loved that segment during the curriculum workshop. I loved the facilitator of that workshop, and it really illustrates the thoughtfulness of the Americans and the Russians and how we navigate this American show in Russia in a respectful way. Can you talk a little bit about the conversation that went on around including children of different backgrounds and abilities? I loved that part.
Sure. The curriculum seminar is really, as Sarah was talking about, the cornerstone of every international production. And in the case of Russia, we brought educators, teachers, physicists, children's health experts together from all over the former Soviet Union. And we met inside the Danilov Monastery, which is the headquarters of the Russian Orthodox Church. It was surreal. Here we were trying to develop what was going to be the content for this new TV show surrounded by all these churches and a whitewashed wall, fortress wall. Initially, the Russian research director, so the entire seminar was carried on in Russian, and we had some Americans present from the American research team who would advise. But essentially, the Russian team, research team, led this discussion. And we had to come up with what were going to be the goals for this show. What did they want to teach? Millions of children in New Russia. How are they going to talk about this new economy, which was called, no longer a command economy, but some kind of, post-Soviet free market economy? And how are they going to teach about democracy? Like, for example, doing scenarios, writing scenarios that would teach, a segment like having the children vote. Do they want to play with crayons or drink juice? Or something like that, for preschoolers. So initially, in talking about some ideas, I raised my hand and said, well, what about doing a scenario where kids are running a lemonade stand? And this is met with horror by my colleagues, right? They're just said, do you mean like children selling things on the street? I said, yeah. And they said, you mean, but in our country, the only people that do that are like mafia or criminals. And I was like, oh, yes, we are only 3 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and any independent commerce is illegal. So these discussions went on, and what was really profound is during one coffee break, the physicist got up and he said, I think this is useless. This is a useless meeting because you are tasking us with designing the curriculum for a show in order to teach young children the values of an open society, and none of us know what an open society looks like. So the American research director, Charlotte Cole, she convinced him to stay. And what he says at the end is remarkable. But in this discussion, one of the most moving discussions arose around the discussion of inclusivity. And we showed a video of a little boy in a wheelchair, which is called, there's a song in the background, super upbeat song, "Me and my chair, we go everywhere," and he's flying a kite. And when the video ends, there's just silence in the room. And one of the educators says, "That's so exploitative to show children in wheelchairs." This was not what I was expecting as a reaction to showing this video. And then another woman says, rather confused, "I don't understand why normalnie dzieci, normal children, would want to watch a TV show with nienormalnie, not normal children." And that was the language used for handicap pretty much universally. So I thought to myself, you know, these are the enlightened educators that were selected by the research director. Maybe they're not ready for Sesame Street. And I was pretty disheartened by the whole thing. And then, you know, the conversation, this conversation went on a good part of the day. And one woman said, you know, what you don't understand, you Americans, is that our country has just collapsed. We have no medical system that's actually working right now. And we have children who are stuck in their beds and their legs don't work. And they'll never get a wheelchair. How will they feel if they see other children with a wheelchair on the TV show and they'll never be able to get one? They'll just feel sad. So after she said that, you know, there was, you know, people were, I really made me think about my own assumptions about this and what we were saying. You know, we think it has to be like this, and so often we think that we expect countries to mirror our own, but they're not at the same historical development that we are in all kinds of areas of value development. And we've had democracy for 200 years, and they haven't. So at this point, I'm thinking, I'm surprised, but maybe their show isn't going to have children with handicap, you know, have children with in wheelchairs and with disabilities. And I think that's awful. That's not. I really don't want to be part of that show. And then this woman who hadn't spoken before, Ludmila Chipurina, raises her hand, and she has a very soft voice, and she says, you know, I work with children in Cheboksary. And this is a region that stretches from the Volga to Siberia. And she says, I work with children every day with disabilities. And we're in our region, this used to be a dumping ground for hazardous materials under communism. So we have the highest rate of children with disabilities in our region. And I work with them every day. I play with them. I laugh with them. And all they want, all they yearn for, is to play with normal children and be seen as a valuable part of society. And I urge you to write scenarios in this new show, in Ulica Sezam, which means Sesame Street in Russian, so that these children are seen and loved. So after she finishes speaking, I look around the room, and half of the people in the room are crying. And I'm crying as well. And it's incredibly humiliating for this to be happening for many of these Russians and Ukrainians and Armenians in front of Americans, where they're essentially showing their vulnerability. So eventually the team decides to include scenarios featuring children in wheelchairs and children with disabilities. And I hadn't uttered a word.
I mean, that is such a powerful story, because you as the executive producer could have come in and into that conversation and said, well, this is how Sesame Street does it. We include children with disabilities. We include children of different backgrounds and ethnicities and races, and this is how we're going to do it. And instead, you open the space up to true dialogue, which led to actual understanding and relationship building and so much trust. And that is a theme throughout the rest of the book, as you see the show actually miraculously go into production, you see this trust, not just between the Americans and the Russians, but between the Russians, between the Americans, and it's truly magical. Like, what if we could all produce children's television shows with other cultures that we don't understand? Because I don't think, even in this day and age where the world feels smaller and culture seems more accessible, we are not building trust and relationships across those lines of difference in that way. And Sesame Street and you gave that Russian team the space to explore those challenging questions, and what they came up with was miraculous. Everything from the set design, they discuss, every Sesame Street production has like a gathering space, and what is that? Well, it depends on the production and where in the world it's taking place. So the Russian team decides that their gathering space is like it's like a square.
It's a
a
dvor.
A dvor.
It's a courtyard.
A courtyard.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you can see that's the scrim, the backdrop there. And the set itself was designed, the set is supposed to reflect a real situation for children, so that it doesn't use magic. Children are not supposed to be resolving their problems with a magic wand. They're supposed to encounter difficulties and then figure out how to solve the problem. So in the case of the set here, when we were talking with the set designer, who was utterly brilliant from theater, not from television, and we explained that in making this set realistic, we proposed that she bring a group of directors together, and one of the directors said, if you want the set to be realistic, it will have to have a rusty car in the courtyard, lots of broken glass, and all the neighbors have to report on their neighbors to the KGB. I mean, there was so much humor in writing this, because there were tons of discussions like this that were just hysterical. And eventually they made this magnificent set where the backdrop and the set incorporated lots of different elements of Russia. And why this is interesting is the set designer came back when she was first sent off to go write draw this set. She came back empty-handed, and she said, Natasha, I just don't know what to do. I don't know. Am I making a set that reflects pre-revolutionary Russia, Russia of our recent Soviet past, or something new that I don't even know what it looks like yet? And so we had endless discussions about this, and eventually came up with a set that incorporated all the aspects of their history. So it had Stalinist buildings, Russian Orthodox churches, the Khrushchev apartment buildings from Khrushchev, the cement, absolutely horrendous apartment buildings, and beautiful pre-revolutionary brick structures. And the buildings that were built on the set itself also were all varied from different periods of history. Let's see if I have another picture of that. Boom.
I loved, there's a story in the book about the leaves on Zeliboba's tree, that the leaves needed to be a very specific type of, I believe, oak. And it took scouring the globe to find these leaves that were eventually transported from China to New York to Russia. But
yeah, it was
so much care.
Yeah,
so much attention to detail.
The drawings that she drew were pencil drawings originally, and they're literally drawings that you could see in a museum of botany. They were so exquisite. And of course, there are oak leaves that have 6 points and 8 points, and so they insisted that their leaves, the Russian leaves, have 8 points, So we literally scoured New York City looking for these fake leaves with 8 points. We could only find 6. And we sent some over to them, and they rejected them because they said, it has to be realistic. So there were all kinds of things like that. When we picked the colors for the Muppets, and I had been trained making Sesame Street in Mexico first before I did the Russian version, because we had so long before we actually went into production. And we had in Mexico, when they were picking the color of the first female Muppet for Plaza Sésamo, the Mexican Sesame Street, the executive producer's wife walked in one day and says, Rosita, Lola, she has to be, Lola is the name, Rosita is American, yeah. Lola, she has to be pink. That was the end of the discussion. I was like, I'm looking around, is anybody saying anything? No. I'm like, okay, she's pink. In Russia, we had a multi-day discussion where my team insisted on consulting the theoretical treatise written by Vasily Kandinsky, the famous painter and philosopher who wrote a book called The Treatise on Color. And they opined on how, none of the puppets could be yellow because yellow causes madness. And, Kandinsky wrote about the emotional effects of color on people. And, of course, red was absolutely out of the question, at which point I said, but the most popular Muppet in America is Elmo, and he's red. They said, yes, that just causes madness. So eventually they picked blue, and that's because that's a peaceful color.
So I want to open it up to questions in case anybody has some. But before we do, can you just speak briefly about finally bringing this show to the children of Russia and the former USSR and the legacy of the show?
It's been a really bittersweet process of writing this book. I wrote this during COVID. I couldn't film anything, and when I was talking to my 2 children about it, and they're now adults, and I said, I really want to write this story. And I had saved all of the primary source materials, so the correspondence from 30 years ago, the videotapes, and had transcribed and translated a lot of these that were shot at the time. And every time we moved, I kept moving these boxes, which drove my husband crazy. There was like half a room filled with boxes. So when COVID hit, I thought, I'm going to write this book. And my children said, essentially, Mom, you've got to write this story. I was like, well, I don't know. They said, excuse me, but they said, this is a shit fucking crazy story. You have to write this story. And so I said, okay. And as I was writing it, I got back in touch with a lot of my colleagues, many of whom I hadn't talked with for a long time. And, they told me about what was happening in Russia with the crackdown on independent media. When the war broke out, many of them were protesting. Some of them are in jail now. And after Putin passed the law about speaking out against the special operation, some of them had to leave within 24 hours. And fortunately, some of them have gotten asylum in European countries. So it's been really sad seeing that, and at the same time talking with my former colleagues from Ukraine, as well as the many people that I've met this past year in London and other places. Like a young woman who left just after the war started with her 2 children, and her husband is still fighting on the front. And I asked her if she knew Ulitza Sezam, and she started crying. And she said, I grew up on that show. And then, we talked for a while, and she said, thank you for making that. That was a vision of what our country could have looked like. So, it's been amazing to meet the numbers of people who saw the show. The show aired in 1996 for the first time. It became a hit instantly across 11 time zones, and it aired on Russia's 2 largest TV stations simultaneously. The show went on for another decade, well into Putin's era, and it ended in 2010. So I woke up one morning at 4 a.m, realizing this was just after the first 1 million Russians had walked out of their country because they didn't want to fight and they didn't support the war. And I realized that's the Ulitza Sezam generation. They grew up on our show. And then a few minutes later, I realized that the Ukrainians, who are now in their 30s and 40s, they also grew up on Ulitza Sezam. And I think that that's the legacy of the show, is those young people who embraced values that Sesame Street inculcated with our Russian team and our Ukrainian team and Armenian and Georgian. And I very much believe that it has been hugely impactful on the country and will play a role again in the future.
Can't underestimate those naked puppets.
For sure.
Any questions for Natasha?
Yeah, please do. Okay. I saw a hand up over here.
What an amazing story. Thank you for sharing it, and I can't wait to read the book.
Thank you for coming.
When you look back, I can see the satisfaction that you got in the motivation that you would have had to continue. But at the beginning, when you faced such enormous obstacles, including assassinations of people that you had worked with, what motivated you? How did you keep going?
It was I built this team. Like when Sesame Street asked me to do this, I really hadn't done anything like this before. And there were no rules there. There was no censorship at the time. We had free run of this TV station in Moscow, which is inconceivable today and absolutely different when I went back in January of 2020 and had to show my passport and was met by 2 FSB agents who really didn't believe me at all when I talked about what I had done with Ulitza Sezam, until they called an audio engineer and they said, there's some woman here from Ulitza Sezam and we know that you worked on the show. And then this was Anton, and he said, is it Natasha Lance? And then the FSB agents were just stunned. And from then, their demeanor completely changed. And I became one of them, one of their friends of the country, so to speak. But, the sense that we had, and it's hard to explain it, but that this is, after 70 years of communism, and I had already lived in Russia for 10 years. I speak Russian. I mean, I had, covered news there and then made films there. I really loved this country, and Sesame Street gave me this incredible opportunity to build a family of sorts with the most talented people from across the former Soviet Union. There were no films being shot at that time. There was no state support. All the films had been made with state money beforehand. There was no history of making episodic television for more than 12 episodes. That was it. We were making 52 half hours. And the team that I was able to build was 400 artists. So you're talking about puppeteers, writers, producers, animators. It was incredible. And we felt like we were about, to change the country, that we were going to be touching the lives of all of these children and giving them not only skills, but a whole way of seeing the world differently. And to be a part of that was an incredible gift. But my husband, my boyfriend at the time, who during this production, I mentioned earlier I didn't have children and I was single and I didn't know if I liked children. Well, I ended up meeting my future husband, and then I was pregnant for half of the production. And so, I learned quite a lot with this group. I had grown personally, immensely from learning from them. And there were many times when I felt like this is too terrifying and something could happen. But, the prospect of seeing it through and what it could do made it impossible for me not, to give up. And I knew if I left, it would fall apart. And also because there was so much opposition. We talked about this earlier, Sarah and I did, within the company. They were looking for a reason to cancel it too, although, we had a large number of people that supported it. So I hid my pregnancy for 5 months because I thought if they find out, anyway, but it was very much, and even now when I'm in touch with these people, my colleagues from, on WhatsApp, it's still incredibly close. Years later, it's 30 years later.
May I don't understand why they so violently oppose this show while they actually embraced a lot of Western American culture, like McDonald's, heavy metal, punk, rock, and only this show? What is that? And the second question, very quickly, are you familiar with Obraztsov Theater? Obraztsov Theater.
Obraztsov, yeah, very much. I've been there many times. That's one of the puppet. There's a puppet museum in Moscow, and it's also they have a lot of Obraztsov's puppets there too. It's a great museum. There was definitely, and many Russians embraced aspects of American culture. But at the same time, there was a great deal of tension related to that adoption. And why it's so important to look at this period now, the 1990s, is because this period, this transition period in Russia, features in Putin's narrative over and over again today. How that transition happened with the flood of Westerners going into Russia and beyond, and making millions along with their own oligarchs, and how that transition took place led to a lot of the animosity towards the West today. And Putin uses that now to justify his own aggression against Ukraine and the West. So, this period was fraught with both the fascination and quick adoption of American culture with a simultaneous revulsion and also humiliation about where they were in their development. So it was complicated.
Question here.
Hi, thank you for speaking to us. I wanted to know about the history and the making of the show, but while history was happening in Russia. So the Chechnyan genocide was a huge thing that happened in Russia, and togetherness in Sesame Street is also a very huge thing. Did you guys even touch on that topic? Were you not allowed to? How did you kind of bridge that gap?
That's a great question, the nationality question. There, in the chapter about the curriculum seminar, it was very difficult because it was during those 3 days that the Chechens basically took many Russians, I think it was like 1,200 Russians, as hostages in the town of Budynovsk. That was going on at the same time where we were having these discussions about the importance of incorporating, understanding of others and making sure that the show reflected all the different new independent countries with their cultures. So that was very difficult. And the Russian research director, Anna Genina, Dr. Genina, that is featured throughout the book, and how she resolved that, how she got them to focus on the purpose of the show related to that, is just fascinating. Yeah.
We have a question here.
Hi, was Jim Henson aware or a part of any of this?
So Jim had passed away before I was hired by Sesame Street, so I never met him. But his daughter, Cheryl Henson, who speaks Russian, is also featured in the book, and she threw my baby shower. So
I would love to be able to stay here all night with all of these people. There are so many more questions, but we're way past our time. Thank you, Natasha and Sarah.
thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much.
We have copies of the book outside for sale, and Natasha will be signing books outside the gallery.